Okay, welcome back to another contextualized reading for Shakespeare's Richard II. This is going to be Act 4, and I think I'm going to push on through Act 5 too, unless I get really caught up. So I was making the case throughout my earlier contextualized readings that a Euro-Christian poetics is at work throughout Richard II, and that secular humanist readings that have tried to emphasize a secularization narrative especially, and this play as sort of signaling a trajectory towards secularization, have a very modernist sort of bent to it. And what I wanted to do is emphasize a little bit more of the cultural poetics, which is Stephen Greenblatt's term, also sometimes thought of as new historicism, where we are really trying to situate a play or a piece of literature within its own literary contextual period. That's sort of Greenblatt's methodology, so to speak, and there's been a building, I think, off of folks like Greenblatt. There's been a lot of interest in political theology as a literary mode of inquiry, if not necessarily a method, that I've been trying to emphasize and describe, and with things like the King's Two Bodies, which Contorowitz did a classic study of as well. And I've been inflecting my lectures with this notion of Euro-Christianity, all lowercase, one word, as a social movement, not as a religion, to address some of the things that we need to be able to understand with what's at stake in the play. And I was saying in the Act 3 contextualized lecture that it's not just the descent or the tragedy of Richard that's being inflected here, and we can use Fortune's Wheel as a way of looking at it, but it's the way that Euro-Christianity has updated and superimposed its sort of notion of divine providence or the divine right of kings, also Euro-Christian notions of justice, onto the pagan formulation of Fortune's Wheel. And so also divine providence, right? So providence with a capital P is especially the what would become the Protestant fixation here, as well as total depravity of original sin, and that what Richard is doing in his descent is becoming human in the way that it was necessary for the Euro-Christian savior to become completely human and completely deprived. And so in Act 3 we saw that Richard is mimicking or presenting the image of Christ, and Bolingbroke is Pontius Pilate who's washing his hands. In Act 4, as we go on here, we open, and there's a kind of parallel, if you remember back to Act 1, right, where we had Mowbray and Bolingbroke in a fight against each other in front of Richard, and now we have Bagot who's accusing Omeril as knowing of and plotting Gloucester's death and wanting Bolingbroke's banishment. And so it's interesting that that the conservative Shakespeare critics of the 1950s don't pick up on this more. And by conservative critics, I mean Contorowitz and Schmidt here, because what we see is like a great disarray going on in terms of the rule of law here. We see that things are disrupt, and throughout Act 4 you will see all sorts of people throwing. If you thought there was some gauge throwing in Act 1, it's just going on all over the place here. Bolingbroke does not allow Bagot to take the gauge up, though, after Omeril throws down his gauge, and this is going to distinguish a difference between him and Richard. So he is stepping in, whereas Richard asked them to make peace with each other So that's just going to be a different mode of governance here. Perhaps one could read it as a more totalitarian way, or more of a decider way. I think in a lot of other cases, people read Bolingbroke as being the better king than Richard. So I'm not going to take sides on those issues. I just think that what's at stake for Shakespeare critics like Schmidt and Contorowitz, I've used them in my lectures not because I think that they're the grandest Shakespeare critics, but I think that they're very good in some ways, and they've become very influential. And also, what we see with them is they had their own agendas and things at stake. So when we're doing criticism, it is very much about the period that we live in now. So my criticism, which takes anti-colonialist terms or deals with racism and Euro-Christianity and these things, definitely speaks to my moment in the 21st century, right, as a teacher of Shakespeare and a critic as well, and that discussion might change. So criticism as an apparatus always is infused with its own ideas, right? So the 1930s critics in Hamlet, Wilson, Knight, and people like that, the way that they were reading Hamlet as a kind of Christ figure also speaks to what's going on in the mid-20th century. There's this commentary on Bolingbroke is showing his differences with Richard here. Then Fitzwater jumps in, and he throws his gage against Omerol. And then Harry Percy joins him. And then a supporter of Omerol throws down his gage. And so we're seeing chaos erupt, right? A plot against Mowbray is revealed. Bolingbroke perhaps knowing that this already existed, which again speaks like to what that question that Shakespeare leaves open, which is whether or not Bolingbroke was planning at the beginning to usurp the crown, or whether or not he is sort of forced into that by Richard, who kind of wants to abdicate it at different times. I think those are different and interesting ways that directors and people have interpreted Shakespeare. It's part of his genius is to leave some of that stuff open. I also have been kind of presenting a reading of course, Richard enacting the image of Christ, and we'll see more of that to come here. So Bolingbroke, perhaps knowingly, because Mowbray is now dead, restores him through, though he's dead, after hearing from Bishop Carlisle how Mowbray fought for Christ. So I think that that's important. And so perhaps, if you're going to be generous to Bolingbroke, he's just being reflective here. But he's seeing a different side to Mowbray. And of course, some critics read this as Bolingbroke just sneering as against his dead enemy, like that he's completely mocking Mowbray. And you can read it that way as well. So there's lots of different inflected interpretations there. York then breaks in and announces that Richard is willing to actually abdicate the throne to Bolingbroke, and he names him, this is the first naming in the play, of Henry IV. So Bolingbroke accepts, and so this is another notch. This is like Bolingbroke is now coming up on Fortune's wheel, but he has not quite gained the crown yet. So there's this formal process that needs to happen. Bishop Carlisle then reacts against Richard's decision and calls Bolingbroke a traitor. And so this is the divine right of kings. Like, to a certain extent, I think Carlisle is right in terms of his reading of just the law. And he prophesizes then. So he, this is a Jeremiad, right, in speeches, the prophecy that says of the bad things that are going to come if you don't repent, if you don't make things good. And so he prophesies, quote, that the blood of the English shall manure the ground, and future ages groan for this foul act. Now, there are various places in the play. There's the famous story of Elizabeth standing up and saying, "I am Richard II, know ye not that," and it causing disruption. Of course, the play was put on famously by her lover or favorite, Essex, the Earl of Essex, in a plot to overthrow Elizabeth towards the end of her life. And Shakespeare's whole troupe, which were then known as the Lord Chamberlain's men, get called in for questioning as well, and they get let off the hook. But definitely Earl of Essex is executed because of that. So these are very, very politically charged plays. But what I always wonder is, I wish we knew a little bit more, and maybe it's out there and I just don't know of it yet. At what point in the play was Elizabeth I's conscience really triggered? That's a really appealing question to me, and I wonder if it's moments like this where we see that Richard is the usurper here. Richard is then brought in, and Richard compares himself to Christ, and this hints at the imago, or the image of Christ, that I've been already mentioning in my reading of the play. Lots of linguistic distinctions between the king with a capital K here and me. There's a shifting away from the use of the royal we into the first person I. It's something to notice. And then we get the famous crown scene. And as has been pointed out and played many different ways, Richard says, "Here, cousin, here, cousin." He repeats it. And the way that is often interpreted is that Bolingbroke has a kind of fear or awe around the taking of the crown. So is this ambivalence on Bolingbroke's part to seize the crown? And this is something that word seize is going to do some work in this scene as well. I think what Shakespeare has done here, though, if you go back to my earlier contextualized readings, is that he's superimposing the image of justice, remember the balance is, onto the wheel of fortune. And you can almost take it like if you look at a deck of tarot cards, you can see that there's the justice card and the wheel of fortune card, and you can kind of see that the circular imagery kind of exists, but he's mapped them on to each other with the imagery of this scene. Very, very beautifully and artfully done here. And the crown is the kind of balancing point. And then Richard uses this water imagery that's so great. "Now is the crown like a deep well that owes two buckets fulling one another, the emptier ever dancing in the air, the other one down unseen and full of water. That bucket down and full of tears am I, drinking my griefs whilst you mount on high." And so we've gone from balance this way to the shift in fortune's wheel, from the horizontal world to the vertical type of world. But also, I feel like there's a way to feel that water imagery as weight and substance in a way that at least Richard's characterizing the crown as a kind of empty bucket that kind of just dangles up at the top, which is really just beautifully stated. Bolingbroke asks, "Are you contented to resign the crown?" Richard says, and with his AI, right? But as the folks on the Plays the Thing podcast have pointed out, that sonically there are different ways to hear this, but on the page, A, or yes, no, no, yes, A, no, or I, no, no, I, for I must be nothing, I must nothing be. So there's this erasing that Richard is doing for himself here, this sacrificing of himself. I must nothing be. Therefore, no, for I resign myself to thee. Now mark me how I will undo myself. I give this heavy weight from off my head. But then Richard ends the speech, as again the folks on the Plays the Thing podcast have pointed out, that he ends the speech in the third person. He's divorced. He's gone from the royal we to the first person I to the third person, distinguishing the I from or Richard from kingship itself. So the language is doing the work of the distancing from the crown. But then Northumberland wants then to add salt to the wound, I guess. That's a way of putting it. He wants him to read indictments against himself while king. And Richard kind of jumps back. It's like, why do I have to do this sort of thing? And he says, though some of you with Pilate wash your hands. Now, of course, this is, again, a reference to Bolingbroke. Showing an outward pity, yet you Pilates have here delivered me to my sour cross, and water cannot wash away your sin. And in fact, not only can water not wash away your sin, he's positioned Bolingbroke as an empty bucket. There is no water to wash it. So that the imagery, it just ties right into that imagery of the well and the crown, and the hollowness of the crown is so beautifully layered and so resonant in so many ways that we really see just how incredible Shakespeare is as a writer. Of course, Richard then identifies himself as a traitor to himself and essentially a traitor to God. And this, I think, is that moment of total depravity. This is where, it's not just losing power, right? It's that it was in you and you are corrupted no matter how good you thought that you were. You are a sinner. Essentially, this is like the Euro-Christian poetics at work. This is total depravity. And this is very much a part of Anglican and Protestant theology. It's not that it's not part of Catholic theology as well, but this is very much of the moment of Shakespeare's period. And he says this, nay, if I turn my eyes upon myself, I find myself a traitor with the rest. For I have given here my soul's consent to undeck the pompous body of a king, make glory based on and sovereignty a slave, proud majesty a subject, state a peasant. It's not just that he's abdicated, he's lost divinity on earth. Now, in the Euro-Christian imaginary, and even, to a certain extent, because it's in the Old Testament, in the books of Kings, and many critics have pointed out, there's some references to David and Saul going on, and this will show up at the end of the play as well. In the Old Testament, I think that people often sort of forget this, that the Jews are arguing with their God because they want to have a king. And what their God, I'll call him Yahweh, even though the Jewish people would say Adonai, right? They would say my Lord, they don't pronounce the name. So Yahweh is a kind of corruption, but it's also an earlier storm god figure. So there are multiple, if you don't know this already, there are multiple competing deities in Genesis, and what we get from earlier Hebrew cultures, you get a movement from polytheism to the monotheistic religion, and what we get when we get the Bible is that the Yahwists have won out, right? So we call him the people who sort of edit together the Tanakh, or the first 5 books. The Tanakh, the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible. the term that we often use is the Deuteronomist historian. That's the person who writes and is able to see, like traditionally Moses wrote the books, but how could Moses have written about his own death? That's one of the ways to think about it. If you're doing Bible as literature, you probably have heard about some of this stuff. But so the Yahwists went out over the Elohists or Elohim, and any of the words like Emmanuel as being also a name for Jesus, which Jesus is the Yahwist term, right? Yeshua or Joshua. Jesus is a version of Joshua. Anything that ends in that AH sound is the Yahweh component, and the Emmanuel component is the Elohist movement. And so sometimes like Christ is figured as Emmanuel, right? They're both but they kind of speak to earlier divergent traditions within Judaism itself. To go back to the king's thing here, like the New Testament does a whole lot of wrangling with these long lineages to try and establish Christ as being the descendant of King David, right? So that's where we're getting some of this divine right of kings stuff going on. But what I think people often forget, because there's so much drama and telling of the stories of kings, the kings are pretty darn corrupt in the Bible, right? They're not really the people that you really want to be like. And that goes back to the idea that what Yahweh says is, why am I not enough for you? Why do you need to have a king on the planet, like on Earth, right? Why? And so it's this contentious relationship that the Jews have with their God that is a little bit different or inflected differently in Euro-Christian thought, as if the Euro-Christians forget that kingliness is fraught, even though their own concept of the divine right and everything is supposed to be wrestling with this. So I draw all of that out to say that that I think that within the Euro-Christian context, it can't just be a lament for the divine right of kings, because they would certainly know that kingship is itself fraught and a problem. But we get after this with Shakespeare in the first decade of the 1600s, you get this shift in Shakespeare where he wants to contemplate kingship beyond or outside of the Euro-Christian context. So Macbeth is set from like in a kind of pre-Christian time. Lear is certainly set in a pre-Christian time, and he starts really dealing with these kinds of like more pagan types of conceptions. Of course, you could say that A Midsummer Night's Dream is before this kind of stuff as well, although we see Christ imagery or Christian imagery all throughout A Midsummer Night's Dream. So it doesn't, it's clear that Shakespeare's version of temporality is not exactly linear, so to speak, in terms of the way that he uses this stuff. So I just want to point out that there's a problem theologically with the idea of kings themselves. Now, being the king of kings in terms of Christian theology, then there's going to be a little bit more inflection there that's not the same sort of wrestling with their God theology that Jewish people have. But it is the majesty of the state. It was the capital K king of the king's two bodies that is being disrupted here. And so then we get the mirror scene, and this is a play on the literary genre of the mirror of princes. Those of you who are writing on mirrors, if you're thinking about that for your final paper, definitely this is something to be looking at, and want to think about Hamlet showing Gertrude herself in the mirror physically, right? Um, uh, th- it's interesting because Richard has become a kind of poet in his exile and an advisor to the king. Because the genre of the Mirror of Kings is something that mimics Ovid, who was a poet who went to exile, or Virgil, but as well as Machiavelli, who was in exile as well. And so Richard has interestingly positioned himself as being someone who's in exile, but also as an advisor to the king. Richard speaks while looking into the mirror as if he cannot remember his own face, but then he breaks the mirror. He never really does what Northumberland wants him to do. And again, there's a prelude to Hamlet here. I think in the language you can hear it. "'Tis very true, my grief lies all within, and these external manners of laments are merely shadow to the unseen grief that swells within with silence in the tortured soul." Think of Hamlet in the past. These are but the passing of suits of woe. That type of language in Hamlet's opening lines. "I have something in me which passeth show. These but the trappings and suits of woe." Is it the actual line there? Richard is then taken away to the under guard to the tower, and then we see some discontent here between the church, between Bishop Carlisle and of course and Omerel, but also an invitation to a revolt against Bolingbroke, and so already there are counter forces at work, and so Bolingbroke's kingship is not going to be peaceful. This transition is not going to be accepted by everybody. And that'll get us to the end of Act 4. I'm going to push on through Act 5. In Act 5, we're back to the Queen, who compares the Tower holding Richard to Julius Caesar's indiscretions, which is interesting. And so Julius Caesar had usurped all of there should have been three powers, right, in the Roman triumvirate, and Julius Caesar usurps and calls himself supreme emperor, and then is cut down by Brutus, only to have Augustus Caesar, his nephew, eventually become Octavian, who becomes Augustus Caesar later on. But the Julius Caesar reference here is obviously comparing the usurper role of Bolingbroke. And in his acceptance of fallenness, though, Richard is just... Everybody else around Richard seems to be discontent with what has happened to Richard. And this isn't to say that Richard isn't, destitute and sad and all of this stuff. But there's a part of him that has accepted what is happening, right? And if we're going to keep reading him as a kind of Christ image, then his wife becomes a kind of Magdalene image here. So that's something to maybe, again, those of you who are thinking about women in Shakespeare, how might the Queen here be figured as a kind of Mary Magdalene? And also as a kind of Ophelia. So again, I just, maybe because we did Hamlet, last week or something, the "get thee to a nunnery" is like I hear that as when "get thee to France" here. But in his acceptance of fallenness, Richard tells her, quote, "Learn, good soul, to think our former state a happy dream, from which awaked the truth of what we are, shows us but this." Oh, that dream imagery. Go back to Midsummer Night's Dream and the way dreams are being figured with performances. But the reality, the waking of the dream, is our total depravity. Again, that's what I think is going on you're reading this play as an expression of Euro-Christianity. Northumberland then interrupts, sends Richard to Pomfret instead of the Tower, and sends the Queen to France. Shakespeare. So Northumberland is really kind of the antagonist character here as well, and I think that what Shakespeare's doing is he's definitely setting up some tensions. Again, I mentioned it earlier with Harry Percy, who is Northumberland's son in this play. Shakespeare creates this fiction with a forced separation of Richard's his wife, as if they were ever lovers, right? They weren't, because she was too young. So this, again, I think what Shakespeare seems to be doing is that, at least to me, this is an externalized severing of marriage as a sacred bond that's not necessarily romantic. So just as the kingship, the capital K of the king's two bodies, is severed and broken, the one of the reasons to have this romantic set up, this true love that's showing up between Richard and his queen, is to show that even when the king's state falls apart, everything else around it falls apart too, including marriages. In Act 5, Scene 2, we see the Duchess of York and the Duke of York discover that their son, or Omerals, plot against Bolingbroke. Remember, he's been plotting this with Carlisle, among other noblemen. It divides their marriage and their family. So again, the family just fucking explodes. Excuse my language there. It's demolished. Like, families can't stay together, marriages can't stay together, sons can't have relationship with fathers anymore. York characterizes the transition of Richard and he says, as in a theater of the eyes of men after a well-graced actor leaves the stage, are icily bent on him that enters next, thinking his prattle to be tedious. Ugh. Because we know that Shakespeare, at least the students in my class, you know that we're working with Shakespeare and his defense of art and the way that he uses depictions of art. And this is just one of just a really poignant moment in Richard II, where he just uses that stage imagery, but also there's a sort of total depravity, I think, of even this scene. Like this is not the all the world's a stage type of view at this point, I don't think. It's not the forest dream of Midsummer Night's Dream. It's that even like the stage and audiences show a certain kind of mundane corruptness. It doesn't matter how well you acted that scene. Just get off the stage and let the next person come in. It is truly genius, and you can probably feel my admiration for Shakespeare coming out here. Even I've been very critical in other lectures about the way that Shakespeare's been used for Euro-Christian colonizing purposes, and he has, but that does not diminish for me his brilliance as a writer. I do want to separate those two things. So Omeral's plot is discovered. He rushes to Bolingbroke for clemency and forgiveness, and Bolingbroke does grant it in a rather magnanimous way. He grants Omeral's pardon before even hearing what the traitorous intentions were. There are lots of pleading. I'm not going to go into it, but we get this fighting and the pleading of the Duchess and her, but her husband and Omeral's father, York, is saying, no, you should this is traitorous. Now you are the king. So York has accepted the fact that now Bolingbroke is king. Like, now he's Henry IV. And you do, no matter how he got there, it doesn't matter if it was corrupt, God put him there, right? So that's the divine right of kings. So even if he's a bad king, even if Richard were a bad king, as Gaunt was showing earlier on, you accept the bad king, right? So York still has that kind of Romans 13 type of vision of authority that he wants to, like, he wants his son to even be punished for this, but so it's interestingly gendered in this way, and those, of course, of you dealing with gender and with women characters in Shakespeare want to focus on this scene. But I say, don't just focus on the Duchess here. Like, please, like, keep the Duchess as the historical figure in tension with the Queen as the poetic figuration that she is, who's completely ahistorical in Richard II. So, and then as we're getting towards the end here, we have this scene where let me get my book out here, where Carlyle's plot has been discovered through as well through Omeral's confession of the traitorous intentions. In 5.4, Exton says that he's heard the king's words and that he plans to execute Richard. That this is what was meant to be said. And if we were going to take the secular sort of humanist reading of the ways that Shakespeare can be read into different generations and speak to the successions of power or the transition of power, I think that there is some compelling stuff in there. I just don't buy the end goal of the ideology of the humanistic reading. But if we think back to like the Trump administration and Comey or the FBI, or the Trump kept trying to say things to his attorney general very publicly, not saying things exactly, but trying to sway things by his own words without actually saying it. So I think that you could do some compelling contemporary reading around that here and around Exton. So Exton believes that he's heard the king's words and then he plans to execute Richard. We go to Act 5. Scene 5, we see Richard in prison. I've been studying how I may compare this prison where I lived unto the world, and because the world is populous, and here is not a creature but myself, I cannot do it. Yet I'll hammer it out. My brain I'll prove the female to my soul the father, and these two beget a generation of still breeding thoughts, and these same thoughts people this little world in humors like the people of this world, for no thought is contented. The better sort, as thoughts of things divine, are intermixed with scruples, and do set the word itself against the word, and thus, come little ones, and then again, it is as hard to come as for a camel to thread the postern of a needle's eye, which is of course from lines from the New Testament, right? So he's referencing the Gospels, but I think that Greenblatt's reading is right on to read that Hamlet does this internalization thing better, but Richard's kind of going crazy. He's kind of going loopy, and we've seen it throughout the previous acts. In Contorowitz's book, The King's Two Bodies, which is this big book that I've talked about a lot, Contorowitz's second chapter is on Richard II, and it is really a wonderful reading in the sense that he says that what we get in Richard is that we get that Richard also plays he plays the fool, right? That what we see happening, he says Shakespeare, and he's talking about Richard III here as well. He's saying that the fool and the king, they're all parts of the same thing. So Shakespeare in that scene conjures up another image of the human being, the fool, who is two in one, and whom the poet otherwise introduces so often as a countertype of kings and lords. Richard II plays now the roles of both. fool of his royal self and fool of kingship. Therefore, he becomes somewhat less than merely man, or, as on the beach, king body natural. However, only in that new role as fool, a fool playing king and a king playing fool, is Richard capable of greeting his victorious cousin and playing to the end with Bolingbroke in genuflection before him the comedy of his brittle and dubious kingship. Again, he escapes into speaking fondly, that is, into puns. Fair cousin, you debase your princely knee to make the base earth proud, with kissing it. Up, cousin, up. Your heart is up, I know. Thus high, and he reaches, and Shakespeare tells us in his notes, which he doesn't always do, he says, touching his crown, thus high at least, although your knee be low. And so one of Contorowitz's points here, which I think is really salient, is that the king and the fool can be figured within the same person. And it does. It's a kind of reference of that collapse of fortune's wheel, right, where the king does become the lowest person. And in other contexts, in Hamlet, we've seen the separation. And so we see that what is at work in Shakespeare's poetics is an overlapping of these kind of character identities onto one another. And in other plays, in King Lear, for example, Lear will go crazy, and his fool will become wise at different times as well, right? So it's playing with the same figuration of of what happens within kingship itself. Going back to the play, Richard says, "Thus I play in one person many people, and none contented. Sometimes I am king." Right. So again, for those of you who were thinking about Shakespeare and how he uses, what his conception of art is and what he's using art for, and we see this kind of emphasis on the performance. Now here is where all the world's a stage kind of stuff is going to show itself up again. Richard says there's the music scene here that goes on, and he's saying, "Ha ha, keep time, how sour sweet music is when time is broke and no proportion kept. So is it in the music of men's lives, and here have I the daintiness of ear to check time broke in a discordant string, for the concord of my state and time had not an ear to hear my true time broke. I wasted time, and now doth time, with a capital T personified, now doth time waste me. For now hath time made me into his numbering clock. My thoughts are minutes, and with sighs they jar their red watches unto mine eyes, the outward watch, whereto my finger, like a dial's point, is pointing still and cleansing them from tears." And this conceit that he does, the way he makes himself into a clock, he's almost, it's weirdly, like, creepily almost like prefigures like the Industrial Revolution or something. You might go that way. Of course Shakespeare doesn't know what's going to come, but there is this, he's become, like, as Contorowitz said, something less of a man, and he's become a kind of machine. Time has killed him, but time, he couldn't keep time right, and music that can't keep measure and can't keep time, but then he becomes this mechanism. So you want to play with that kind of imagery. Now, sir, the sound that tells what hour it is are clamorous groans which strike upon my heart, which is the bell. So sighs and tears and groans show minutes, times, and hours. But my time runs posting on in Bolingbroke's proud joy, while I stand fooling here. So again, the fool, right? His jack o' the clock. This music mads me. Let it sound no more, for though it have holp madmen to their wits, in me it seems it will make wise men mad, yet blessing on his heart that gives it me, for 'tis a sign of love and love to Richard is a strange brooch in all this hating in this all hating world. Ugh, it's beautiful how Shakespeare has done this. I'm just, in awe, as many people are. And then we get the groom who comes in and interrupts, and then there's eventually we get Exton as well, and there's this exchange again. Shakespeare loves to do this in his plays, especially towards the end. He loves to throw in the lower class, the lowly people, and get their perspective as well, talking to kings here. But the madness themes, the fool theme, that the fool is and madness is part of king, that insanity is part of kingship. And we've seen this, that even in Shakespeare's time, he would know that some of the earlier Henrys, that there is some madness and mental instability going on. But you can see it in Game of Thrones as well, right? If you watch that show, The Mad King. And so Exton comes in, and the murder happens. Richard says, "How now? What means death in this rude assault? Villain, thy own hand yields thy death's instrument." And he seizes the servant's weapon and kills him with it. He's trying, "Go thou and fill another room in hell," and he kills another servant. And then Exton strikes him down, and so there's this bloody situation that's happening. "That hand shall burn in never-quenching fire that staggers thus my person, Exton. Thy fierce hand hath with the king's blood stained the king's own hand." And the king is capitalized here in the text as well. And so there's this like retreat into the idea of his own kingship, but he's also hinting at the king's two bodies. "Mount, mount, my soul, thy seat is up on high, whilst my gross flesh sinks downward here to die." So he literally separates himself, and he at least believes or says he's going to heaven. Exton says, "As full of valor as of royal blood, both have I spilled. Oh, would the deed were good, for now the devil that told me I did well says that this deed is chronicled in hell. This dead king to the living king all bear." And then to the keeper and remaining servants, "Take hence the rest and give them burial here." And that we could take that, and you could go into Macbeth with the kind of the killing of the king, the immediate remorse that comes. You could take it into Claudius. So once you read a lot more Shakespeare, you start seeing how he's reworking and like almost like pieces of a chessboard or something like that. He's playing out different games with similar characters. Then we get finally the last scene here, scene 6, Act 5, and we're back to the court, and we see King Henry here, listed as King Henry in the text. "Kind Uncle York, the latest news we hear is that rebels have consumed with fire our town of Chichester and Gloucestershire, which but whether they be taken or slain we hear not." And so already things are just in an uproar, right? And then Northumberland comes in and wishes his happiness, and then he even announces that the heads of Salisbury, Spencer, Blunt, and Kent, the manner of their taking may appear at large discoursed in this paper here. They're quashing rebellions as well, right? And then Fitzwater comes back in, and Fitzwater says, I have from Oxford sent to London the heads of Brocas and Sir Bennet Seeley, two of the dangerous consorted traitors that sought at Oxford to thy dire overthrow. And King Henry says, "Thy pains, Fitzwater, shall not be forgot. Right noble is thy merit, I wot." And then Harry Percy comes in as well, and he's brought the Abbot of Westminster, and notice here that Henry, excuse me, so let me just go back here to what the grand conspirator, Abbot of Westminster, with clog of conscience and sour melancholy, hath yielded up his body to the grave. But here is Carlyle living to abide thy kingly doom and sentence his pride. And so Carlyle is from Bishop of Canterbury, right, which is south east of London. And so and this is the seat of the main connection to the Catholic Church as well. And notice that Henry has reverence here, and he says, Carlyle, this is your doom. Choose out some secret place, some reverend room, more than thou hast, and with it joy thy life, so as thou livest in peace, die free from strife. For though mine enemy thou hast ever been, high sparks of honor in thee have I seen. So he's not willing to completely break with the church, right? Here he's not going that far. He still has some reverence for the church, and I think that is important, especially in considering Shakespeare's own situation with post Henry VIII and Elizabeth. And then here we get Exton comes in and announces that he's brought Richard of Bordeaux the body. And notice that he's called Richard of Bordeaux. He's no longer at all referenced in a kingly way. Extant, I thank thee not, for thou hast wrought a deed of slander with thy fatal hand upon my head and all this famous land. And this is what I was alluding to earlier in discussion. And I think they talk about this in the Plays the Thing podcast too, that this is an Old Testament play on David and Saul and Saul's execution, because so David again is angered at the executioner of Saul because Saul was God's appointed king, but at the same time, they wish it but they don't wish it. And so what he does is a deed of slander with thy fatal hand upon my head and all this famous land. Exton says, from your own mouth, my lord, I did this deed. And King Henry says, they love not poison that do poison need, nor do I thee, though I did wish him dead. I hate the murderer, love him murdered. The guilt of conscience take thou for thy labor, but neither my good word nor princely favor. With Cain go and wander through shades of night. The Cain and Abel imagery has been throughout this play, the slaying of brethren, right? With Cain go wander through shades of night, and never show thy head by day or night or light. Day nor light. Lords, I protest, my soul is full of woe, that blood should sprinkle me to make me grow. But he was saying that he would do it earlier. Come, mourn with me for what I do lament, and put on sullen black incontinent. I'll make a voyage to the Holy Land. Remember, I said that earlier. What is he doing? He's going to make a voyage to the Holy Land to atone for the sins of usurping the crown, to wash this blood off from my guilty hand. Again, that kind of Pilate reference, right? March sadly after, grace my mornings here, and weeping after this untimely bier. And so ends Richard II. Just to wrap up here, I was kind of mentioning it earlier, is that in Shakespeare criticism I've mentioned Ernst Contorowitz and Carl Schmidt, and one of the reasons I've been doing that is to show that although they're interesting critics of Shakespeare and interesting readers of Shakespeare, they of course have their own agendas and they're reacting in their own moment in different ways. So Contorowitz, as a scholar, was part of the same right-wing conservative German movement during the 1920s. called the Stefan George Circle, and they were obsessed with notions of mysticism, notions of kingship. They were not the same as the National Socialists, but they were another right-wing conservative group. Contorowitz was living in a family of assimilated Jews. So they were not practicing, but they were Jewish. And because of that, Contorowitz, once the Nazis came to power, he eventually had to leave Germany. He makes his way to the United States. He works first at UC Berkeley for a number of years, and then refused to take the oath. So under the McCarthy era, or post-World War II, really, there was concern about people's political affiliations. And he was no communist. He was a right-winger, so he hated communists, and he pointed this out to the regents of California, University of California, and they were requiring professors to sign oaths saying that they would never do anything disruptive to the government. And this is one of the reasons why in the 1960s, by the way, why Berkeley became such a place of public protest, and why we today think of Berkeley as a school where there's been so much unrest, and where professors had prompted in the 60s students to this kind of protest. Contorowitz refuses to sign, and he's going to lose his job. He gets hired at Princeton, where he spends the rest of his career. I think he dies in the early 1960s. The King's Two Bodies comes out in 1956, and that's his study it's his classic study of kingship, of the King's Two Bodies. But what it's laden with is duty and government and transitions of power, and of course he's lived through so much of this. Now, around the same time, Hamlet or Hecuba, Carl Schmitt's book, comes out too. So these are two both conservative right-wing critics. Carl Schmitt did become a Nazi and was very anti-Semitic. So a lot of the right-wingers and the German right-wingers in the 20s were not necessarily Nazis, and a lot of them rejected National Socialism, but they're still right-wingers. So it's just interesting to think that those, and I think in American mindsets, it's just like, oh, well, it's just all the Nazis, or not. And so we have read, or I've at least referenced a couple of very conservative thinkers here. I also referenced more contemporary stuff. Kevin Curran, who's at University of Lausanne, I believe, right now. My younger brother introduced me to this book after taking a class with Kevin Curran. What he seems to be focusing on, Shakespeare's legal ecologies, is looking at land and property law relationships, which I think is very interesting and important scholarship to be done. And the argument that Kevin Curran is making is that what we see is that, again, so secular humanist perspectives tend to focus on the individual and the human, like the human rights, the rights-bearing individual of liberalism, and current criticism on Shakespeare is poking holes in that narrative that's been too focused on liberal individualism, which is not at all really part of Shakespeare's actual era. And so they're talking about ways that subjectivity is much more porous, to use Charles Taylor's term. He's a Catholic philosopher who's written a big book called The Secular Age. It's super long. It's like 800 or 900 pages long. And he has these two terms, and he calls it the porous self and the buffered self. And the porous self is the late medieval, early modern self. So people didn't think of themselves as individuals in the same way. They were more porous, more sponge-like. Whereas the buffered self is the term that Charles Taylor uses for modernity, which is going to say the kind of self that people who say when Hamlet is kind of a precursor to modern man, in quotes there, that we see that kind of buffered self as well. So why is that important to my reading? All of that is to say, so my reading has emphasized some anti-colonial impulses that I have, and it's been emphasizing Euro-Christianity as a worldview and saying that we need to look back at Shakespeare. One of the reasons to look at Shakespeare is because he is just this like superb expression of Euro-Christian worldview through poetics and through not just like I've said and tried to emphasize, is that you cannot divorce religion from politics, from subjectivity, or even if it's a porous subjectivity in Taylor's terms. So then when we look back, we could go to Contorowitz, and Contorowitz is the one who said that if we still believe in some version of the King's two bodies, which seems, when you do look at the last U.S. election between Biden and Trump, the way that people tend to infuse the U.S. presidency with this kind of aura, like, oh, well, but does the presidency remain no matter how contentious individuals get? It's the office of the presidency. So when people talk about the insurrection on January 6th, for example, part of what's going on there is that the rule of law is sort of breaking down. It's not, people aren't having faith in the actual governing processes or the rules themselves, and that's where the treason comes in. The treason comes in because there is no sort of sense that the rule of law is doing its ruling, what it's supposed to do in terms of carrying on the capital K King's body, to use the King's two body metaphor, the capital K King's body, or the capital P U.S. president, with other people in between. Things have gotten so rancorous between party politics and identity divisions that there's less and less holding the continuum together itself, right? So when I go back and I look from a Euro-Christian perspective and take an anti-colonial perspective, I actually see these kinds of, it's not exactly theology, but it's like there's the aura, or the aura of glory around all this stuff. Now, all of this, the people, for example, who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, many of them, they see themselves as patriots, right? So there's a kind of nationalist sort of drive there, and what's happening is there are kind of large, maybe tectonic shifts in how we might think about what our legacy is as a nation, as I'm speaking to U.S. citizens right now. And I think that Shakespeare's play can definitely help us sort of give language to some of those affective movements that are going on there, and they can also help us shed light on Euro-Christianity as a social movement and how it has perpetuated colonizing forces that are still in existence today. And I personally have an anti-colonial take. It doesn't claim to try and be neutral. It's anti-colonial. But even if one disagreed with me on the anti-colonial part of that, I still think that the anti-colonial, seeing that as a critique of Shakespeare, helps us see what's at stake in terms of what people are arguing about and against, and that at least if we have some sort of discursive way of trying to map out our affective tendencies, that I still maybe believe in at least the possibility that stories and literature can allow us ways to think and talk and articulate things with each other, but also that they can show us the expressions of something deeper and worldview, and that when we take a worldview perspective, and we can see, especially, again, I'll always come back to a difference between Euro-Christian and Native American or indigenous worldviews. If you see that difference more clearly, then you can see not only ongoing Euro-Christian colonization, but you can see that there are people who exist outside of that, which I think is very hard for Euro-Christians to see. At times, they oftentimes accept that the civilization, or the civilizing, in quotes always civilizing, mission has been accomplished through the arrival of capitalism and liberalism and all of that. Okay, so agree with me or don't agree with me on that. Hopefully you've found some insight from the lectures. On Richard II, I do believe that they're expressing Euro-Christian poetics in Richard II, and to try and read him in just a universalized humanist way is actually a perpetuation of Euro-Christian colonialism. The uses of Shakespeare, the way that Shakespeare has been used for Euro-Christian colonialism, does an injustice to Shakespeare the writer, in my opinion. And those uses, I would hope that they would go away, but in hoping that they will go away, that's not an argument to say that we should not read Shakespeare at all. He's useful for many other things and many other reasons than the conventional secular humanist ones. Also, calling the secular humanist ideology out does not imply at all, and ought not to imply, that I'm advocating for any kind of particular religious take, right? So just be sure, the anti-colonial take is something that calls into you to question Euro-Christian supremacy as well, and different expressions of Christianity will be different ways that they are ideologically attached to the deeper Euro-Christian worldview. Okay, hope that gave you some things to think about. We will carry on, at least in my class, with The Tempest next, and then we will be reading Aimé Césaire's A Tempest, and so some of this anti-colonial talk will start making a little bit more sense as we near the end of the course this summer. Thanks very much, as always, for listening and watching. Hope you have a great night or day wherever and whenever you come across this.